In the 4th century BCE, Greek intellectual life ran into a structural problem that existing practices simply could not resolve. Arguments circulated widely in philosophy, law, and rhetoric, yet no stable method existed for determining when one conclusion followed necessarily from a given set of premises. Disputes often lingered, not because the positions themselves lacked clarity, but because there was no shared procedure capable of separating valid inference from persuasive assertion. In the end, agreement tended to rest on authority or long-standing convention instead of any demonstrable form, and that gap placed real limits on the stability of knowledge. This is before logic, a history of rules before they were written. Aristotle's work took on this constraint directly. He isolated one particular domain of reasoning and gave it formal structure. Rather than trying to capture every kind of thought, he concentrated on deductive inference, those cases where a conclusion had to follow if the premises were granted as true. What later became known as syllogistic logic examined arguments according to their internal arrangement, setting aside the specific subject matter involved. A syllogism is built from 3 propositions, 2 premises together with one conclusion. Across the whole construction, exactly 3 terms appear. One of them, the linking element, shows up in both premises but disappears from the conclusion. The other 2 each occur once in the premises and together make up the conclusion. Validity hinges entirely on how these terms line up. When the arrangement holds, the conclusion cannot be false provided the premises are true. When the arrangement fails, even the strongest plausibility cannot secure the outcome. Here, a formal line emerges between validity and truth. A valid argument keeps necessity intact even when its premises fail to match reality. An invalid one loses that necessity, though its conclusion may still turn out correct by chance. This separation opened the way for reasoning to be examined apart from empirical content. Inference itself could now stand as an object of analysis. Supporting that analysis, Aristotle sorted propositions by their logical form. He grouped statements according to quantity and quality, universal or particular, affirmative or negative. Those distinctions shaped which combinations could yield valid syllogisms. He set out the workable configurations and showed, through demonstration, why they preserved necessity. From then on, evaluating an argument turned more on spotting its repeatable form than on unpacking the meaning of its separate parts. Further refinement came with the idea of figures. Each figure grew from the position occupied by the linking term inside the premises. Different placements produced their own collections of valid and invalid forms. The resulting classification made it possible to group arguments, set them side by side, and test them in an orderly fashion. At the same time, the setup allowed a kind of recursive check. One syllogism's validity could sometimes be shown by means of another. Inside Aristotle's larger project, the syllogism held a defined place. In the posterior analytics, demonstrative knowledge moved forward from premises that were true, primary, and immediate by way of valid syllogistic chains. The syllogism served as the basic unit for scientific explanation. Knowledge came to be seen less as a simple gathering of observations and more as the arrangement of propositions into structures that displayed necessity. Stability in knowledge therefore rested on the stability of those structures. Yet Aristotle never presented syllogistic logic as the whole of reasoning. In the Topics and the Rhetoric, he looked at other approaches that worked through probability, plausibility, or persuasion instead. Those operated under their own constraints. The syllogism stayed one specialized instrument inside a wider range of intellectual practices, not a model meant to cover every form of thought. The system also placed demands on the concepts it employed. Terms needed to remain stable and sharply bounded. They were frequently arranged in hierarchical relations, with broader categories taking in narrower ones. This classificatory backing was not separate from logic, but helped sustain it. Any ambiguity in a term could break the inference, and shaky classification weakened the whole framework. Logical analysis, therefore, stayed closely bound to the way knowledge itself was organized. For all its precision, the system carried clear limitations. It worked best with categorical propositions of the subject-predicate type and struggled with relational statements or more intricate patterns of quantification. It gave no account of how premises themselves were to be reached or justified, nor did it settle disagreements over the classifications on which the terms depended. The line drawn between validity and truth helped clarify the structure of reasoning, yet it left the question of securing truth itself unresolved. Scholarly readings of Aristotle's exact intentions still differ. The texts that survive point to a systematic effort developed over time, though they stop short of anything like a single, fully unified system in the modern mold. Later traditions, especially in the medieval period, took the approach further. They expanded and standardized syllogistic logic, adding symbolic notation and mnemonic devices that do not appear in the surviving Aristotelian writings. Those steps carried the system well beyond its original setting. Historically, its persistence owed much to the way it functioned as a constraint. It offered a method for checking the inferential step that stood free of speaker, immediate context, or subject matter. Legal arguments, theological exchanges, and philosophical discussions could all face the same formal standards, even when their contents diverged sharply. The system never removed disagreement. It did, however, shift where that disagreement tended to settle, often into the premises or the classification of terms rather than the inference step proper. Attention moved away from pure persuasion towards structure. A further layer of analysis took shape in which arguments could be examined apart from their rhetorical dress. At the same time, the syllogism depended completely on premises supplied from outside. It had no power to generate or verify them. Its role stayed limited to preserving necessity once those premises had been accepted. In that sense, it operated strictly as a constraint, acting inside the larger activity of reasoning. The appearance of syllogistic logic showed that at least certain aspects of inference could be isolated and placed under explicit formal rules. Reasoning gained a stable, analyzable core with identifiable parts and more predictable behavior. This core did not settle every dimension of thought. Still, it supplied a foundation that later developments could build upon or measure themselves against. In the next episode, we will examine classification as the architecture of knowledge. This will involve the organization of concepts into structured systems that support reasoning and inference.